Claire. All right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order for the City of Kenmore Diversity, Equity, Inclusion meeting today, Thursday, April 7th, 2022. I will now take the roll. And I would like to please ask that the task force members have your cameras on and say you are verbally present as I call your name. Thank you. All right, Darlene Ademba. Juanita Aguilar.
Present.
David Arthur. Marco Ballesteros.
Present.
Lily Bishop.
I'm here.
Bill Castro. Jeannie Galloway. Oh, Bill Castro, I see you're here.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Present.
Jeannie Galloway. Carlos Skill. Juliana Pulley. Juliana?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Nancy Tai.
Present.
And Sam Otis.
Present.
And I just wanted to let you know that Aisha Jallo and Peggy Evans are excused for today. Is there anybody else? Sam Otis, I called you. Anybody else I left out? Is everybody here? Okay. All right, folks, thank you so much. And now it's time for public comment. And we'd love to hear from you. So if you could please raise your hand now if you would like to speak, and you will have about 2 minutes to give comments. Clerk, do we have anyone from the community who is raising their hand?
We have John Peoples. Let me promote him.
Good evening, Task Force. Can you hear me?
Yes, John.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, I had no intention of being first to speak. I'm surprised I'm the only one, but I wanted to bring something to the attention of the task force, and that is something on the DEI website in tools called the Pyramid of White Supremacy. And it's very important to me, sincerely, that the DEI task force do everything in its powers of decent and fair discourse to delete that vile racist propaganda from the Kenmore City website. The Pyramid of White Supremacy is deliberately a tool used against people of a certain skin color. It is a political propaganda. It's racist propaganda. And I'd like to sincerely ask that the members of the task force understand this. If the Pyramid of White Supremacy is still propagated and celebrated by the city of Kenmore at the end of your tenure on the task force, then the DEI task force will have been for naught. If you're really serious about diversity, equity, inclusion, and not inequality and exclusion, you will have the Pyramid of White Supremacy deleted from the city's website. It is pure racist trash. Please delete it. Thank you. And happy to discuss with any of you, any of your topics.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peoples. Is there
You're
anyone else
welcome.
that wishes to be heard today? Leonore and Shannon, I don't see any additional hands.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to, before we move on, for the purposes of clarification, offer some insight on a pyramid of white supremacy. So the purpose of diversity, equity, and inclusion is to cast a wide net, to bring all voices to the table, and to make sure that we approach this topic with honesty, with clarity, and humility. And in doing such, there is never a time that you can resolve the challenges that we face to build a better tomorrow without acknowledging the opportunities and strengths both of our past. And I don't know that you'll find many academics that have studied the history of this country and its development that will deny that people that are called typical able-bodied do not enjoy privileges that people with neurosensory or physical differences have. People that are cisgendered heterosexual have privileges, rights, and benefits that members of the LGBTQIA plus community still don't enjoy and have. People that are English speakers still have access and opportunity that people that do not speak English as a second language don't have. People that are poor don't have the same rights, privileges, access, and opportunity that people that enjoy wealth have. And people that are Caucasian, non-Hispanic still enjoy access, rights, and privileges that people of color do not have. And so in the academic discourse of this country, I don't know that we can honestly approach this topic without acknowledging that those differences and those realities do exist. To be racist would be to engage in words or behaviors that would perpetuate more than 400 years of history that benefits Caucasian non-Hispanics to the detriment of others. That was the founding of our country. And it's interesting, I just spent the last week at the Liberty Bell, at the Supreme Court, at the White House, at the nation's People's House. I was on tours at Jamestown, at Gettysburg, at the site of the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation at the African American Museum. And all of these places, I was there with kids that were 11, 12, and 13 years old, talking about the history of our country and our original sin, and explaining to them and sharing with them that for as great as this nation is and the opportunities that it affords folks, that was not our beginning, but it was our promise. And it's the job of this task force to look with honesty, humility, clarity, and with the singular purpose to make sure that we continue to work toward the promise that all people in this country should breathe free, and that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should be enjoyed by all that come to these shores. And the only way that we can do that is to look at our past and to be honest about that past, and for all of its strengths and all of its weaknesses, and then to build policy, to build process, and to build programming that takes that history into account. And so as long as I am entrusted as part of this process, the road that we take will be the one that will look honestly at who we are, who we have been, and who we endeavor to be. And that means that we have to look honestly at our greatness, but also at our opportunities to grow. So with that, I will move us back to our agenda. So I'll pivot back to you then, Leonora, for approval of our minutes. Oh, we have another hand up. Can we still do are we still doing public comment?
No, we're done. I was going to move on to approval of minutes. Did you see another hand up, Shannon?
Yeah.
We're good?
I think Mr. Peoples' hand is still up. He may have forgotten to put it down
Okay.
after speaking.
Okay, thank you.
I'm also noticing that Jeannie Galloway is joining you in just a second.
Thank you. All right. So with that, welcome, Jeannie. So I will move forward with the approval of minutes. And at this point, we will move to this next step, which you received prior to the meeting, team. So I will suggest we approve the minutes through unanimous consent. All in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, so hearing none, the minutes stand approved. Thank you. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next agenda items, discussion, policy development, and early insights. And Shannon, I will hand the mic to you. Thank you
so much.
And thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And so tonight we have a special guest, Debbie Bent, who is the Director of Community Development at the City of Kenmore. We wanted to have a conversation and a presentation and conversation with the task force tonight to talk about the planning advisory group of the council. Now this body, and you'll be reminded of this later, is tasked with looking at planning for the city of Kenmore, making recommendations to the council, but in an advisory capacity. And so Debbie Bent is going to be presenting to you what the current plan is today. And we're going to be talking about your experiences, your insights, your perceptions, but most importantly, we would like to be able to engage in a conversation and probably get some recommendations from you on both planning now and what they might consider for future development, especially as it impacts the missing middle. And you'll hear more about what that term means. But for now, do we have Debbie? Is Debbie on? Is she ready?
Yes,
Good, perfect.
I'm here.
There we go. So, there you go. So let's move on to Debbie and her presentation, and then we'll have a conversation immediately following.
I think, Shannon, if it's okay, I think the city manager would like to say a few words prior to the presentation.
Yes, I'm sorry, Rob, your name wasn't on there. So let me have Rob Karlinsey, city manager, City of Kenmore, address us first, then we'll move on to Debbie. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm just going to give a real brief intro to Debbie. But first of all, I just want to thank you all for giving us the time. So,
we're having a little trouble hearing you.
Hear me at all? How about now? Can you hear me now?
It sounds like you're garbled.
Okay. Well, I'll just turn the time over to Debbie.
And you could also type something into the chat box, we'll see as well.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. I do have a short presentation, and I've asked Leonora if she wouldn't mind sharing that because I'm having trouble with two screens, and if I try and share something and I can't see you all or see if anybody has questions. So tonight we're here to talk a little bit about housing regulations and land use. So how does a city regulate what happens with land use? Those are zoning regulations, and those regulations kind of tell you what uses you can do where. So tonight we're going to focus on housing. But before we get into that, I think it's just important to spend a little bit of time on the framework for housing and look at some of the past regulations which were exclusionary, and also look at some of the past financial practices which are also exclusionary, before we get to today, which is looking at what the Planning Commission's work is to look at broadening the uses allowed in the single family zones. So this is an introduction, and as Shannon says, I'm Debbie Bent, I'm the Community Development Director. So my job with the city is to do policy planning, to look at long-range planning in the city to see what does the city want to look like in the future, and work with the Planning Commission and Council to put policies in place and implementing regulations. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Leonora. So just to give some history on exclusionary zoning and racial covenants. And as I said, zoning is the practice of regulating uses, land uses in a city. So in 1910, the first exclusionary zoning was put in place by the city of Baltimore, and several cities followed soon after. In 1917, those exclusionary zoning laws were challenged all the way to the Supreme Court. And at that time, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional. So local governments could no longer put in place zoning regulations to enforce housing segregation and prohibit the sale of property to racial and ethnic minorities. Well, when that happened, that cities couldn't do it, what happened then was that individual property owners were putting racial deed restrictions or covenants on their properties for the sale of homes. And these agreements banned the sale of homes in a neighborhood to certain racial and ethnic minorities. And they were an enforceable contract, and an owner who violated them could forfeit their property. So this went on, and then a Supreme Court case in 1948 ruled that these covenants could no longer be enforced by the courts. And at that time, in 1948, over 50% of housing had such racially discriminating covenants. And even though the courts struck it down, it was still legal for realtors and property owners to discriminate based on race. Next slide, please, Leonora. And it wasn't until 1968, with the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, which banned covenants discriminating based on race, color, religion, or national origin, and made it illegal to refuse to sell or rent a home to any person in a protected class. However, the Act did not prescribe how to deal with existing restrictions, those racial covenants that were already in place on somebody's deed or title. In 1969, Washington followed closely after the Supreme Court and again said racial covenants were void and had no legal effect. So since 1969, they're not legally enforceable at all. But in 2018, what went into effect in Washington state, it gave property owners a way to legally strike those racial covenants from documents affecting the title of properties. And a modification can be recorded with the county where the property is located. Next slide, please, Leonora. So for those of us in King County, if you have such a racial covenant still existing on your deed, you can record a restrictive covenant modification document. And this is free to do, although there may be a slight charge to notarize it. And what will happen then is there will be language that goes on your deed, which basically says that those prior racial covenants are null and void and unenforceable. It does not delete the historic record, but it legally strikes it. Next slide, please, Leonora. So there has been research done by the University of Washington, and I've put a link in there to the website that shows where these racial covenants were in effect. And this website also showed that here where we are in Kenmore, there were such racial covenants, and you can see what they are there, and still surprising to see that those are in effect. But they're not legally in effect. They have not been legally enforceable since 1968. So next slide, please. So that's just a little bit of history on exclusionary zoning and racial covenants. And then what also was affecting discrimination was banking practices, financial practices. And this, you may have heard of the term redlining. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration, as part of the New Deal to stimulate the housing market, put into effect ways to provide federal funding to finance mortgages. And the Federal Housing Administration, they insisted that the properties that they insured use restrictive covenants. And the Homeowners Loan Coalition produced maps to decide which neighborhoods would make secure investments and which should be off limits for issuing mortgages. And green and blue neighborhoods had majority white populations and were considered good investments, and it was easy to get a loan in those neighborhoods. Yellow neighborhoods were considered risky, and red areas, which were those where the redlining term came from, were those with the highest percentage racial and ethnic minority residents, were ineligible for FHA backing. Next slide, please, Leonora. So the redlining practices were in effect until 1968, again, when the law was passed to prohibit racial discrimination and legally sanctioned redlining policies like those used by the FHA. So even though that happened in 1968, the impact of those policies and those decisions and those financial practices is still being felt today. It goes beyond the individuals who were denied loans based on the racial composition of the neighborhoods. And many of those neighborhoods today are still underdeveloped and still underserved compared to nearby green and blue neighborhoods with largely white populations. Next slide, please, Leonora. So let's talk about zoning laws in terms of discrimination. Again, zoning laws regulating land use. And the Supreme Court case in 1926 ruled in favor of a small town in Ohio who had set aside large areas for low density single family homes and very little area for industry or apartments. The law didn't say anything about race or immigrants and was purported to be all about maintaining the rural character from the nuisance of industry and multifamily. However, by its nature, it was discriminatory because apartments and industry could not be located in Euclid. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the town. And since that time, even though discriminatory lending practices and restrictive covenants and redlining had ended, cities began to put in large lot single family zoning, and this has largely gone unchallenged. So you can kind of see in the patterns of land use in many cities that single family zoning is also considered exclusionary because it keeps out most renters and low-income individuals, often people of color, out of a neighborhood. And it restricts the kind of housing to single family housing, not allowing townhouses or any other kind of multifamily housing for rent. So here's the city's zoning map. So you can see that the yellow areas are the single family neighborhoods. They are in 3 shades of yellow. And so you can see that that is what the city is largely zoned. And you can see that the concentration of commercial areas and higher density residential areas is largely located along SR 522 and around the downtown area. The green areas are parks. Those are the light green, and the dark green is the Inglewood Golf Course, and the dark blue are public facilities like schools or City Hall and the Park and Ride. So that's what the zoning looks like in Kenmore. And in those single family neighborhoods, it is mostly allowing single family homes. There are a few exceptions, but that is what the majority of use is in those yellow single family areas. Next slide, please, Leonora. So missing middle housing, what is it? So missing middle housing is a term that was coined by Opticos, a firm who was looking into what happened to missing middle housing. It's the kind of housing, duplexes, triplexes, and cottage housing, which was very common in the 50s and was often intermixed with single family homes in neighborhoods or in downtowns. And it offers an alternative to apartment living while providing numerous benefits. So it can offer more inclusive neighborhoods. It's a way to reduce barriers and to fight systemic racism. And it provides a way for people who wish to live or stay in Kenmore. It provides more attainable housing and more housing choice in the gap between single family homes and apartment buildings. It adds a variety of housing types to meet changing demographics and generational needs. And it gives more housing choices to workers like school teachers or first responders, tradespeople, etc., who have a job but find it very challenging to break into the housing market. And we all know that there is a housing crisis right now. There is a shortage of supply, and the shortage of supply and a high demand means that housing prices are really high. So it's very challenging for people to break into the housing market. So again, providing a choice, this kind of housing is relatively more affordable than a typical single family home because they are typically smaller. And so it offers more choice. And sort of one example is, somebody might build a duplex and live in one and rent out the other, whether it's to a family member or somebody else. But again, it's a way of making housing more affordable and offering more choice. Next slide, please, Leonora. So the Planning Commission, as Shannon mentioned, are a recommending body to the council on policy issues affecting land use. They provide policy language, and that language is typically in the city's comprehensive plan. This is a planning document which describes what the city will look like in the future and how growth will be accommodated. And it has several chapters, such as housing and transportation. And that's the policy document that guides decisions in Kenmore about growth and what kind of, infrastructure is needed to support that growth. How that policy, and we'll focus on land use, is implemented is through zoning regulations. So the council asked the Planning Commission to look at missing middle housing, to look at policies and put those in the comprehensive plan, and develop implementing zoning regulations. So the Planning Commission has spent last year working on this particular topic, on developing policies. And last November, we had significant public outreach, and we held an online forum to see public input on the Planning Commission's preliminary recommendation. And the Planning Commission are recommending an incremental implementation approach. So they, what are they suggesting? They are suggesting to allow duplexes, which is 2 units, and triplexes of 3 units in the R6 zone. So that's some of the yellow zones in Kenmore, close to transit within a quarter mile. So typically missing middle housing is provided with easy access to neighborhood commercial areas. And in Kenmore, there aren't really a lot of neighborhood commercial areas. So transit is being used as a sort of a supplement for that. There are 2 transit corridors in Kenmore, one which runs east-west along Bothell Way, and the second one runs south along down Juanita Drive, and then to 153rd, so that's running east, and then south down 84. So those are the 2 transit corridors. So that's where these duplexes and triplexes would be allowed. And the reason for not considering allowing those in the R1 and R4 areas was because in those areas are largely close to critical areas like Swamp Creek or steep slopes. So the R6 areas, and thank you, Leonora, for going back to that, are those sort of gold areas that you can see in most of the areas of Kenmore. And the lighter areas in yellow are where the steep slopes and wetlands are. So as well as these implementing regulations, the Planning Commission are also putting a policy in the comprehensive plan to state that, a future implementation measure would be to consider other opportunities to expand the missing middle approach to other kinds of missing middle housing, like cottage housing or quadplexes, and also to look at maybe housing on smaller lots and to look at broadening this to other areas. So currently what this map is showing outlined in the purple area are R6 zones within a quarter mile of transit. So within that area is where the Planning Commission would be recommending you could locate duplexes or triplexes. So as the Planning Commission are a recommending body, they are intending to hold a public hearing, which is a formal way to get public participation, and that will be held in May. So the public will have another opportunity to attend the Planning Commission and give formal comments, although comments can be received at the Planning Commission at any meeting, kind of like you're doing here at the DI Task Force. And then following the public hearing, the Planning Commission will then be making a final recommendation and then presenting a final recommendation to the City Council. If there are significant public comments, then the Planning Commission will then evaluate this preliminary recommendation and could make changes. But assuming that this is the recommendation, they would then present that to Council in late June. And then Council could then decide if they want to adopt it. They would then adopt it by ordinance, and the Council could also make changes. And significant changes, there would be an opportunity for another public hearing. So that's currently what the city is doing to address exclusionary single-family zoning. It is looking at missing middle housing as a way to do that and proposing an incremental approach to do that. So that's my presentation, a brief overview of the history of housing discrimination and what the city is currently doing in the single-family zones with the missing middle. And I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any.
Go ahead, Bill. Castro?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Super. Are your slides available on any website? Those slides you presented?
No, I just put those together for your purpose this evening. So they are part of the packet, so they are available to the public.
And are they on the DEI website?
They should be attached to the agenda, yes.
To the agenda, okay, thank you.
Juliana?
Hi, thank you so much. This was fantastic. So I'm loving the idea of expanding housing along the transit lines. That makes a lot of sense to me. Is there any estimate of potentially how many more housing units or families could potentially be impacted by this? Do you have any idea of what the scope would look like by this proposal?
I don't have those numbers right in front of me. I will say that if you look in this area, a lot of the area is already developed. There is not a lot of vacant land, so there's maybe not be a lot of new development. It might be a question of redevelopment over time. So it might be sort of a slower process because of that in these particular areas. Shannon, I see that Lily has her hand up.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. This was really great. To piggyback on this question, if we don't have a lot of empty lots within the purple areas, and it would take a time for redevelopment, have we thought about more immediate ways to address the gap in housing?
I think that there's always a way. You have to start somewhere, which is why the Planning Commission are recommending an incremental approach. I think if you look around the city in general, there are opportunities developed. There is not a lot of vacant land, and the vacant land that you often see is constrained by things like wetlands or steep slopes. So this is not intended to solve the housing crisis. It's not intended to fully solve the housing problem. It is a start. The city is doing other things other than missing middle housing to address the housing crisis. They're currently, for example, looking for proposals to put a housing project on land the city owns close to downtown. We've adopted other regulations for housing. With the pandemic, the city provided funding to assist renters. So this is just one tool in the city's toolbox for addressing the housing shortage issue and creating and sort of increasing supply and creating housing choice.
Thank you. I guess my ask would be to further discuss more immediate ways that we could address the gap in housing. It would be something I would be very interested in hearing more from the city. I appreciate the effort and I agree it's a start and we need to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. But I also feel like there are so many things within the world happening and we are being told a lot of things and having to have patience and what to do now for the people that need help now. And another topic I would like to bring up and ask for your thoughts are equitable access to the water. I think it's something I also would like to hear more about, particularly any possibilities to convert any of the commercial areas in between 522 and the Sammamish River into areas that are more focused for community usage, access to the water and housing.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Lily. If actually, Rob is having technical challenges, but he had sent me an IM, and if I could read it really quick, it says, please let the group know that he believes zoning and land use is an important part of the systems we need to change in our society, and it can start right here in Kenmore. And in her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, I don't know if I could pronounce the name correctly, Ijeoma Ulo'o said that changing our attitudes and biases is not enough. We need to change the systems that perpetuate and entrench current inequities. Zoning and land use is one of those systems. Tools like missing middle housing unlocks more land and housing choices and therefore changes the system. So Rob via chat wanted me to share that with the team.
Thank you, Leonora. David.
Hi, everyone. Just had a couple comments. Is the change to the R6 zoning going to happen sometime soon? Has it happened already? And then if the city's going to create a program for developers to come in and build that housing that's needed. And then also with the restrictive covenants, is the city going to do outreach to those people in those homes in those areas with the restrictive covenants to ask them to do the necessary paperwork to remove the covenant?
You asked a lot of questions there, so I'm going to try and answer them in the order I heard them, but if I miss any, please, I'm sorry, just remind me. So I think your first question was timing for adopting these regulations. And the Planning Commission, we think that they'll be presenting a recommendation to Council in late June, which means it will probably be July when the ordinance is adopted for the missing middle housing. So I think that was the first question.
Yep.
And then one question was, is the city going to outreach to any of the property owners who potentially have these racial covenants to ask them to sort of say that there is a way to legally strike them? It's not currently on the work program to do that. We can certainly, I guess, put some information on the website about that, about the way to find out if you have such a covenant and how to legally strike that. So that's one thing that the city could do. And then I'm blanking on your third question.
That was is the city gonna run a program for developers to create the necessary R6 zoning housing?
When you say create a program, I'm not sure.
Well, are they gonna, because you're saying that it's gonna be development over time, so obviously someone's gonna have to come in and build that housing. So they're gonna create a program where they're gonna ask developers to come in and buy up some of the housing to create this missing middle housing.
Well, what the city's role in land use is putting the regulations in place to allow that development to happen. And typically then the city doesn't, other than the land that the city owns, the city doesn't own a lot of the land, doesn't own land in that area. So it's really then up to the individuals who do own it or for developers to do that. But the city isn't going to, you know, go out there and purchase land or give financial incentives to developers to do that. It's setting the table to allow that private development to happen.
So I suppose once regulations are put in place, that developers will just know that the regulations have changed and the city's open to creating this housing, and are they going to tell them that, okay, the regulations are in place and we're not going to impede developers creating the housing?
Well, we wouldn't impede the developers if the regulations are in place. If the regulations are in place and a developer comes in and they comply with the regulations, then you know, the permit would be issued and the housing would be built. In terms of how people get to know what's going on in the city, we have a pretty broad distribution list for the Planning Commission and the council. And we kind of outreach, we had a developer panel involved. So developers kind of figure out what's going on and they pay attention when rules change. So we have outreach, and we outreach to the public, and then we would also we've outreach to developers as well as part of the Planning Commission process.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Would it be possible for the city to expedite permits in the R6 area? For those projects, in a way not to have to come up with any resources in land and financing?
Could the city expedite permits? Yes, but there needs to be sort of a reason for expediting permits, because that will then probably take more resources. So it's a resource question for the city. So that's kind of the first consideration of whether it makes sense to expedite permits, and then who is going to bear the cost of expediting the permits. So it's a resource question the city would have to consider.
Thank you. Juliana?
Okay, so I'm hearing that it doesn't look like there's a lot of space, brand new developments. And I definitely see that locally. Debbie, do you have any idea, even just a ballpark, how many, I don't know how to say this is a question, I apologize. I recognize that there's programs, there's housing choice vouchers, there's Section 8, there's various housing assistance programs through the Housing Authority, through King County, sometimes through other nonprofit organizations that sponsor types of housing to make it affordable. How would you say the City of Kenmore's relationship is with those organizations? Could there maybe be more outreach or incentives, or is there any way you could lower barriers so that people who are maybe living here or would like to live here could, you know, have other gateways in? Does that make sense? Like what does that space look like for Kenmore?
Well, the city has sort of good relationships with King County, all the housing authorities. The city is a member of a regional coalition for housing. That's a regional group who also has a way to fund affordable housing. So the city is a member of ARCH, and that organization funds affordable housing in its member cities. So that's one way that the city has committed financial resources to build affordable housing. Section 8 housing, again, it's something that the city doesn't directly control. It is a way that people can use those vouchers to be able to access housing. I would say that is probably not what missing middle housing is. So it is definitely, missing middle is one component for affordability, but I would say that Section 8 housing is getting at the deepest level of affordability.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Thank you.
And it's also important to note that what Debbie is talking about tonight is inventory.
Okay.
She's talking about
not just access to inventory specifically.
Yeah. So there's a difference between access to the inventory as it exists, but what she's talking about is what is being built, what kind of structures are being built specifically, and where are those structures being located. And so missing middle is those types of, and I want to even right now say that there's a difference between low-income housing and affordable housing. Yes. And so missing middle is more about affordable housing and making sure that inventory exists, because right now, if you look at the median cost of homes in Kenmore, where's the Kenmore for at the median right now, Debbie?
Oh gosh, I would say it's probably around 800,000.
Yeah. So for someone wanting to own a home, and especially that it's very competitive in the North Shore, Bothell, Kenmore, Everett, Shoreline, Lake Forest Park area, you're talking about anywhere from 800,000 to 1.5 million. That is not people that are middle income. Those are not teachers and firefighters and secretaries and other middle income earners. So it makes the proposition of home ownership something that is that much more difficult to acquire, to attain. And if you are someone who is straddling the line between low income and middle income, you are even further off the mark for those folks that are in the community. So it's really about, the conversation really then becomes, how can you move away from what has traditionally been the larger lots with single family homes to a structure where you might divide a lot or build other units or other dwellings on a lot that are smaller in structural size, with the smaller square footage that would be lower price, that would be more within that range of what would be affordable. Is that correct, Debbie?
Yes, that is correct, Shannon.
And so I would draw your attention back then to, and I'll put it up if I need to, and I still see you, Juanita, I'm gonna come to you, and then Lily. But when I looked at the maps, I'm always looking at I always look at as someone that's an analyst and someone who has to provide for advisement and consult. The low-hanging fruit for me is to look at the development plans and look at the population map and look at who lives in those areas. And those areas generally within cities where there is not a lot of investment in infrastructure and housing, investment in growth and development of the business corridor, those are generally lower income. which is not synonymous with people of color, by the way, but lower income, and also people who are oftentimes people of color. But you also have people that are Caucasian, not Hispanic, that are lower income in those same areas sometimes as well. But those are folks who are concentrated in areas with higher, because they're trying to put them closer to transit, and there's a value to transit, but locking those areas is a whole other form of redlining. And for Kenmore, it's essentially purple lining, because you put them onto these paths of the 520 corridor in Juanita. So you are more likely to be concentrated around high traffic patterns. You're more likely to be concentrated around areas of higher industrialization. And then all of the opportunities, but also challenges in those areas. And there's some development and build of infrastructure into the gold zones, but it doesn't go deep into the neighborhoods. And so there is still a pattern that is existing. So imagine if you one of those families that wants affordable housing that is away from those higher density corridors around the busier roads, and you want to be in a neighborhood that's embedded in the community where it's more quiet, where your kid can walk down the street to school and ride their bikes. Those are things that you find deeper into neighborhoods. So I wanted to draw your attention to things like that, because again, one of the things that I would like for us to be able to do and to offer to Debbie to be able to take back to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission can consider that as part of their recommendations or your recommendations, even at the end of our equity process, recommendations that you might make to the council is, what do you see as missing? What do you think they should double down on or look at, or even in expanding their focus? Juanita?
Hi. Actually, you touched on something that I was going to say about those types of housing being next to the zones of transit, but not really deep into where the other housings are. I was going to touch on that, but you did a beautiful job on that, so thank you. I also wanted to bring up what's the tools that are using for assessing like safety. I know historically a lot of these tools have biases in them because of the implicit bias of the people that were developing them. So going over tools that may be recognizing some of those biases in the tools, and maybe having where the people of the community go out and for themselves and do walkability assessments, how it's different for somebody, like me as a woman who lighting is very important to me. And I remember I had this conversation with my husband about lighting, and I had worked swing shift for years at the hospital. I would come out and to my car and have my key in the middle of my fingers, looking around the safe. And one time I asked him when we were out at night, and I was like, "Darn, are you scared? Give me those keys. Aren't you scared?" "I'm not." And it was different for him and different for me as being a woman out in dark. So the assessments are going to be different about lighting and safety depending on the population. And so I'm hoping that some of those assessments that are being done surrounding implementing safety measures, sidewalks, would have the people included from different populations in how they feel and what those needs would be and for them, and what they would look like implementing for them. So is there space in the planning process for that type of assessments?
Yes, there are policies around walkability in the city. There are plans in terms of different kinds of access, whether it's pedestrian, so sidewalks, or transit, so bus routes. So yes, there are policies around that. And so the city then has built well, the significant infrastructure right now is being built along the Juanita Drive 68th corridor to provide that northwest connection. There is, if you get deeper into the neighborhoods, there is less infrastructure there. And that was another reason why the Planning Commission were looking at these particular areas, not only being close to transit, but also being closer to some of that infrastructure like sidewalks. So yes, when things are built, there is definitely a way to look at, is it safe in terms of lighting or accessibility or other safety measures? So yes, there are a lot of policies and regulations that speak to access and safety.
Okay. Are they from the populations that actually use, you know, to outreach those populations that are using them, but might not have the voice to say that what they need?
Yeah, there's always public outreach. I think what you're perhaps getting at is to make sure that there is a tool in place that you make sure that you have done just that, that you have reached out to the populations that would be living, working, or accessing, you know, how they access resources, how they get from, you know, transit to their home, how they walk through the neighborhoods, how they walk to schools. So yes, I think, you know, I'm hoping that out of the task force results that there will be a tool so that when the city does adopt such policies or regulations, that it ensures that it is done so with a DEI lens.
Lily?
Debbie, back to my first point, if I could get your thoughts, can the city look into repurposing some of the industrial and commercial areas? And I think we can't leave this conversation without talking about the cement plant, and look at potential uses for those areas that would be more focused in the community, would have more value to more of us.
The property, those are privately owned properties. So the uses are there because they've been there a long time. The zoning regulations which are in place would allow different uses to happen there. But again, it's private property. So you would have to wait for those private property owners to come forward with a proposed development. Those current industrial uses, you couldn't do again. So those new heavy industrial uses like the concrete plant, you couldn't have a new concrete plant in Kenmore. It's just existed a long time. So for redevelopment, you are essentially waiting for the private property owners to develop it. And the city has put the rules in place to say that when it does redevelop, it could redevelop as something else. So the only other way would be then for the city to purchase property, which would then, but again, that's a cost. It's a whole other bigger discussion about the city purchasing property.
Now, could the city facilitate the purchase of certain areas by developers? Can the city identify desirable areas to convert out of those industrial and commercial zones and facilitate that with developers that would then purchase and develop the land or the property into the new use?
Well, the part of that property, there is a developer interested, not specifically in the concrete plant, but in that larger pink area that you've probably heard it called Lake Point. So there is a current developer interested in redeveloping that property. That's as much as I can say right now. So if that moves forward, then that property would be developed as something different. It would have to comply with the rules that are in effect for land use there.
Do you think that this is something the city would look into, this type of partnership, or is it something that the city try not to get involved in?
you're asking then if there could be a public-private partnership for a development? I think is that what you're asking me? There has been an example of a public-private partnership in the city, and that was for the downtown Kenmore Village development, where the hangar building is, where Spencer 68 and the Link property is. That was a public-private partnership where the city purchased the land and then worked with a developer to develop it, and then kept a portion of the land back for providing community facilities, the town green and the town square. So it has happened in the past.
Okay.
Thank you. David?
Hi, Lily. I just wanted to point out that a few years ago, there was a developer trying to develop that Lake Point property, and asked the city for approximately $100 million for the project, and the city couldn't afford it. So that developer did back out. So any developer coming in is going to be looking for a large amount of money to facilitate the project. So hopefully, a private developer can do it without asking for the city to provide too much money.
Right. I'm a commercial banker, so I know there's money out there to be had. I just wonder if there could be more incentive in more intentional pursuit of those interests from developers from the city.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Well, I think that the city, as part of economic development, does outreach to businesses to say that we are, open for business, are, friendly for development. So there is certainly that aspect to, outreach in the community to letting developers know that, we are ready and willing to, and we have the land use regulations in place, and we're ready to process permit applications.
David, did you have something else that you wanted to say? Your hand's up. Okay.
I did not.
Okay. Did anyone have any recommendations? Do you have a lived experience that you want to share where you think it might provide for some insight? Is there anything that you'd like the city to consider as they focus and move forward? So while you see what the plan is today, these are annual plans. And is there some area of the Housing Commission's, some aspect of the Housing Commission's recommendation that you'd like to have them consider in their ongoing collaboration and recommendations with the City Council? One of the things that I'm thinking of, right away is to make sure that they consider development, and we did hear that it's incremental, but I would like to make sure that as part of that planning, that if the execution of this incremental approach happens over a very long period of time, I would like to see them think about executing more rapidly into the neighborhoods, their plans to develop into the neighborhoods away from the busiest corridors. Juliana?
I would love, so I see that this housing proposal talks about duplexes and triplexes, but I noticed at the beginning of the presentation, there's a call out also for cottage housing, which my understanding of cottage housing, it's very small houses. And it doesn't look like that is part of the next steps. So I currently work with refugees, and I am every week driving some various refugee families from Linwood through Kenmore for various purposes. And there's a spot in Kenmore right by Linfield Park where you're kind of like about to turn onto, is it right, 62nd? And there's kind of a street of, I don't know the exact coordinates, I apologize, of these little houses. And without a doubt, task force, like every time these new immigrant families, they're like, oh, I love these houses. And they talk often about how they just want, they want a standalone home, but they know they can't have this grand, $800,000 home. So I hear often from the refugees and immigrants that I work with about the demand for cottage housing or bungalow housing. And so I would just love if that specific type of housing, and I'm not just talking about people that are like desperately unemployed, like they are part of they are middle, they are educated, but they are, they're facing some barriers. And so I would just really encourage the Planning Commission to not forget like the small houses, because there are I do believe that there's a strong demand for those. So that's the feedback I wanted to pass along.
Thank you. Sam?
I was just double checking to make sure. I know this was mentioned, but I feel like it's important to make sure that there's communication between members of the community and this committee talking with the council to make sure that like there's open communication between what the community kind of expects from this and then what the council is working for to provide for the community.
Good. Thank you so much for that. Anyone else? Debbie, if you don't mind, and I don't know that you know this, you may or may not know this, but currently, what does the public outreach and engagement look like for the Planning Commission? Do they, are there listening sessions? Do they do any sort of robust engagement with the community to be able to get better insight or recommendations from a broad swath of the community, so that when these considerations are made annually, especially as a part of their process to come to recommendations, do they engage with the community, talk to those folks who might be most impacted or especially most disparately impacted as they consider growth and development in the city?
Thank you for that question. Yes, for particularly with the City Planning Commission, we had a public participation plan developed with a consultant to make sure that we had done a really good level of outreach to the community. We made sure that there was translation into Spanish, Russian, and Mandarin Chinese, which are the three top languages in Kenmore. When we had the panel discussion in November, we had a Spanish, we had a virtual room set aside with a Spanish speaker who was available to translate. So all the materials have been translated when they go out citywide, so that it's easy for people to see the materials in their own language, or to call in, and we can then make sure there is an appropriate speaker that they can have their questions asked and answered. And we'll be doing a similar kind of outreach in preparation for the public hearing in May. So again, we had a plan that we tried to follow. And again, I think maybe as part of a deliverable for the DI task force is a tool to make sure that for public participation on whatever project the city is working on, make sure that we have involved the folks that are truly going to be impacted, to make sure it's easy to provide input and feedback.
And Debbie, can you share with us what has been the representation from the minorities? You mentioned all the resources. Did they show up? Did they actually come in and gave you some things to think about and questions? I
don't really have a breakdown, but like I say, we've had pretty good turnout, particularly at that open house, virtual open house in November. We had a significant turnout of individuals. I don't know, it wasn't broken down by minority or ethnic representation, so I don't have those numbers.
Yeah, my recommendation would be that I know there's a lot of good intention and effort to include everyone, but we need to make sure that it is working and we are attracting those voices and those voices are comfortable with speaking up. So I urge the city not to do that and say we did what we could, right? We offered the multiple languages, we offered the platform, but if that's not the channel, they'll actually get the responses. You take a look into it, and again, the community, all of us here, big example of how willing we are to help and get those requests and those voices from the community to you.
Okay. Well, I would certainly appreciate any voluntary outreach that you're willing to do in your neighborhoods to kind of get the word out that this particular project on missing middle is coming. Like I say, we are doing that outreach, and I do appreciate your suggestion that maybe it's good to have stronger metrics to evaluate how the participation was working. So I know that we have some metrics on the participation. I think what you're saying is you need to make sure that the metrics have reached the audiences that you were targeting to make sure that the plan has done what it said it's done. So yeah, I would not disagree. That's probably an area that the city could improve on in all areas. And maybe that's part of the deliverable that comes out of the task force with some appropriate tools for measuring.
Thank you. I appreciate you considering it.
Yes.
Anyone else? Oh, Sam.
So looking at the presentation, it seems like there's like some like vagueness on like what the timeline is going to be like. So you said something about like being presented in July and then like slowly being implemented over the years. Is there like a certain goal of like by the year 20 blah blah blah? Is there going to be like you hope to have Kenmore's median house price at like a lower value than what it is now, or do you hope to have like a more broader like selection of houses at a variety of prices? Like what's the overall goal for that?
So just in terms of talking about housing choice and selection in terms of type of housing, on the slide that's currently up there, you'll see that an implementation measure that's being suggested in the comprehensive plan is to look at other opportunities to expand locations for this type of housing and to look at broader types of housing. So if this continues as an implementation measure, then that will continue to happen. And I guess Shannon's question is, how soon? So if it's recommended as a policy, as an implementation measure, to, in other words, say that this approach on missing middle needs to go further in terms of type and area, it's a question of timing. So that is something then that the council would then consider in terms of timing. How quickly do they want to do this? So they could take the Planning Commission recommendation, they could potentially adopt that, and they could say, but we want to go further. And then there would then be the next phase then, whether it would be looking at a broader area or looking at other types. So the timing question is really in the hands of the council to decide.
And so, so for the DEI task force, you might offer a recommendation for the task force to, as part of their recommendation to the council, or you could recommend to the council directly a recommendation to go further. You could ask them to consider moving forward more expeditiously with an expansion of development into neighborhoods. You can have them, you can offer, because again, these are all only recommendations. You could offer a recommendation for them to consider accessory dwellings, duplex, triplex, cottages as part of that plan for development in terms of escalation. But there can certainly be a recommendation to go further than what you see here today. And Debbie, just for context, in terms of how these things move, I want to make sure that the DEI task force is aware of what that means, because a recommendation today would generally take motion, and then you would see the effects of those recommendations when?
So the effects would be felt after the regulations were adopted. So if we assume that the recommendation is currently presented, gets adopted by council in July, then it would be in July then where somebody could come in and propose a duplex or triplex in these areas. If the question then is how soon could you then expand it further, you would then have to amend the comprehensive plan to kind of show where that larger area would be. And that would then come forward the following year if it requires an amendment to the comprehensive plan. The other way where perhaps it wouldn't involve an amendment to the comprehensive plan would be if you broadened the selection of the type of housing within that quarter mile. That would be sort of a shorter time frame to happen. So that's one option.
And then for the purposes of information for the task force, how often is the City of Kenmore comprehensive plan updated?
There are state rules in effect that say you can only amend the comprehensive plan annually. There are a few exceptions. You can make changes to development regulations or zoning regulations that are consistent with the comprehensive plan policies more frequently than that. You can, it's only if, for example, the zoning changes need to affect policies in the comprehensive plan. That's when you have to have the comprehensive plan in place first, and then the corollary development regulations follow.
I was going to ask that, which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, the chicken in this case is the comprehensive plan, because that's the policy document. The zoning is the implementing regulations. So in this particular case, the comprehensive plan has a map which shows the area for where missing middle housing would be allowed. So there would be a map in the comprehensive plan. So if you wanted to make that area larger, you would then have to amend the comprehensive plan as well as amending the zoning regulations. So there is a tie between the comprehensive plan policy document and the implementing zoning regulations.
Thank you, Debbie. Did anyone have any questions regarding what you just heard? And remember, there is no such thing as a stupid question. This is a lot to take in. And if you don't do development, or it's not something that you see often, I want to make sure that we can explain this in a way that is as plainly as we need to make it, so that you understand it, you track it, you understand it enough that you can offer some, excuse me, I'm sorry, some insight or recommendation. Jeannie?
Yeah, it's really been a great conversation. I'm following it well. And, you know, a couple of things I wonder. In the particular place that I live is in an HOA. And so I guess I have a question about, you know, so the city has, you know, made changes to codes. Does an HOA have to respond to that, or are they allowed to say, well, we understand that the city is going to allow property owners to build cottages on their property, but we as an HOA aren't going to allow it? How does that work legally? I'm super curious. I'd be curious. I'm super excited about maybe, you know, having higher density in the HOA that I'm in. You know, I might want to put up a mother-in-law residence behind my home, but I don't think it's allowed by my HOA. So how does that work?
Well, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not an attorney, but typically the city does not enforce HOA regulations. So if the HOA said, for in your case, Jeannie, that an ADU, accessory dwelling unit, was not permitted, but somebody came in and applied for one, the city would issue the permit. It would then be the homeowners association would have to challenge that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And
oh, excuse me. Can I just say one other quick thing? It's curious. I mean, it's not curious. I think it's typical. I look at, at this map, and, the areas along the river are all yellow, right? And I understand, I actually live in that general area. So I know we're on a steep area, but it's sort of typical that anytime you have a chance to be near water, that seems to be the places that those that get to have those, and the water access is not as much available to those who have not. So I just think it's curious, as you look at the map and you look at the slough, the creek there, there are very fine homes along that waterway. And to me, it's like, oh, is it really because it's steep, or is it just because it's nice, it's nice property and people would not want to have that changed by having higher density? I'm really curious about whether it's true that the steepness of those plots is the reason. So I'm a little suspicious.
I'm not exactly sure how to answer that.
I know. It's just an observation. I don't know if it's a question. I don't know what it is. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I was pointing out that those areas, kind of where Swamp Creek is and along the river, are zones probably R1 or R4, because there are critical areas, and then there are setbacks from the river or from the stream, which then sort of limit development. So that was the Planning Commission's rationale currently for not including those areas. But again, that probably would be somewhere to look at in the future.
Julianne?
I'm trusting when you said there's no dumb questions. Okay. Earlier we talked about how average home price in Kenmore probably $800,000. And then obviously missing middle is not the same as like the very low income. So do we have a ballpark number of income or housing price that we are talking about trying to match with housing? I know we spoke vaguely about making sure that, our teachers or social workers or, but do we have, kind of parameters that we're hoping? Have we defined what the middle is?
We've defined what the type of missing middle housing is. We know it will likely be somewhat more affordable because it is small in size. But in terms of land use, we don't go the extra step to sort of take the step that you were suggesting, in terms of matching, I guess, the cost with the person who's purchasing it. That's sort of a little outside of land use regulations.
And that makes total sense. And I recognize today we're talking about inventory. I was just trying to think like, if I do go and talk to my neighbors, I know if I could say, I'm just thinking potentially if there was outreach on this, I think it would be helpful. I imagine we could say, we want all of our teachers that are making X amount of money, or we want my sister-in-law who's on single woman salary, or you have some sort of like range to humanize it. But it sounds like we're not there yet in the discussion. So I just wanted to check. Thank you, Debbie.
And just for clarification, Debbie, I think that what Juliana is asking is the people that we consider the missing middle, is there a band in terms of income level? People between what income and what income generally?
Yeah, I apologize. I misheard the question. Thank you for clarifying, Shannon. Yes, there is that kind of data, and I do have that data available. So rather than me guessing, I would be happy to maybe provide that to Shannon and she can share that with you.
Good. Send that over to Leonora, copy me, and we'll make sure that it gets to everyone on the task force.
Happy to provide that.
Thank you so much.
And for folks in the gallery with the public, we'll make sure that gets on the website, onto the agenda for as part of tonight's meeting in terms of resource information as part of follow-up. This PowerPoint that I've been clicking through tonight is already there, and we'll add that additional information. Juanita?
Yes, I am worried about that. There's always a worry that what you're developing is not going to get to the people that you're developing it for, that somebody else with the more means and more opportunity are going to come in and grab that affordable place to live. And instead of having a homeowner, somebody there that like just couldn't, I barely got into the house, is now owned by somebody who, instead of a homeowner, is now renting to other people instead of somebody that could have been a homeowner because of that affordability. So that was just, I know that's always a worry when you develop something. It's not always used as it was intended to. So that was just my input, and how to, I guess we need to, I guess that's also an inventory question too, is it's a slower process, but that also means it's the people with the more means are going to be able to be there and take up those housing opportunities that come up. So that was just an observation that a comment I guess I was making, that that's always a worry.
Mm-hmm. And that's an astute bit of insight, because up and down especially the West Coast corridor, between Southern California and Vancouver and other areas. I know that was an issue Vancouver talked about. It's an area that this region talks about all over the place on the East Side corridor and in Seattle. Oftentimes you have people who are either local or overseas investors that will make a cash offer sight unseen to buy a property. And it's an investment property where they will likely never live in that house or in the community. And all of a sudden that what could be affordable housing is not part of inventory for someone that will be the property owner that will live in the property, but it's part of an investment portfolio. So that's a good question.
Shannon, are there ways to tackle that in any way? Like either have you seen anything been done as far as, I don't know, legislation or any creative ways to make sure, the properties go to the people intended?
I know that Vancouver did something. I can't remember what it was that they'd done, but I don't remember if there was something with regard to the tax structure or requiring that someone have to live in the house for a prescribed amount of time. I'd have to check, but I do know that whatever happened in Vancouver, BC was something they recommended happening in this region to curb.
Yeah, so maybe the city could look into that. And I just wanted to go back to Jeannie's point of equitable access to the water. I think that's important to us. It feels like we are expanding it now with Lagoon Park, but if there are opportunities for the city to allow everyone to, have a beach day, it's really hard to do. And I think everyone is going to benefit from having that type of recreation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I am going to, in the interest of time, pivot back to Leonora Polania and move us along on the agenda, where she will share the date, time, and location of our next upcoming meeting, and then adjourn us.
All right, everyone. So our next meeting will be Thursday, April 21st. Before we adjourn, did anyone have any other questions before we close out? No, okay.
I'd just like to make a comment and say thank you very much for having me at the meeting tonight. It was a pleasure to be here, and you've given some great feedback and questions. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And Debbie, thank you so much for joining the task force meeting today. And thank you, task force members, for your comments and contributions. As you can see, we have a ways to go, and that's why we need you on the task force. And with that being said, everyone, meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.